Thank you so much, Donagh, for joining us today for this conversation post your screening of Tukdam Between Worlds at the main auditorium at the Dharamshala International Film Festival. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the research process that went into the making of the film, especially the field work that might have gone into digging out the stories that you have, the interviews with the lamas, their family members, and then following that, the scientific research into the phenomenon or the practice of Tukdam. So, it's especially because your film also sort of shows a certain kind of acceptance of the incertitude of science in a way, which I found really interesting. So I was wondering, in talking about the research process, could you also perhaps touch upon the possibility of in conclusion to the practice or the understanding around Tukdam?
Right. Yeah, no, the whole kind of development and research process for this film was a very long and kind of unusually involved kind of process for me. So I've made previous films in the Tibetan culture world and in India, and I've been interested in Tibetan Buddhism myself for quite a long time. So I'd heard about this phenomenon of Tukdam, where these practitioners die in meditation and they stay lifelike sometimes for weeks after clinical death. So it was back in 2012 when I heard about the case of Tenga Rinpoche, a very high Tibetan Lama in Kathmandu, who was in this state at the time. I was visiting a Tibetan monastery here in the region, and that kind of really perked my interest. So I started interviewing just some local lamas and monks at the monastery about this phenomenon and how to understand it. And so then I kind of let it simmer. I was looking a bit more into it. Actually, originally I was planning to have Tukdam as part of a kind of documentary with different chapters, different episodes. It wasn't going to be just about Tukdam. It was about some other stuff also. I won't go into that now, but in the end, just Tukdam was such a deep and fascinating subject that I kind of focused on that. So then the real kind of first proper filming was in 2014. I got some small research grant from Finland for this, and we came with a really good cinematographer. I've worked with him a lot before, and it was just this kind of very like a perfect research trip where somehow things just fell into our lap. So it was only 3 weeks, but we got a lot of the story of this family father who died in Tukdam and his daughter, which is like one of the kind of main storylines in the film at that time. And also we went to Kathmandu and filmed a lot of the stuff around another Tukdam story, Tenga Rinpoche, that time. And we made interviews with many big lamas and stuff at that point already. So for the Tibetan side, how I guess got access to it. I mean, one thing was I'd been knocking around in this world for a while, but also I had connections with some very respected high lamas like the Karmapa, who was very supportive of the project, and Thai Situ Rinpoche, who appears in the film, also gave an interview for us at that time. So these connections, I think, really helped with the Tibetan community, where there's great reverence for these kinds of religious leaders. And actually, both of these Tibetan stories that we feature in the film, the story about the father and the daughter, and then the one in Kathmandu, they're both connected to the kind of line of Tibetan Buddhism that these two religious leaders I mentioned, the Karmapa and Thai Situ Rinpoche, are kind of figureheads of. So they were kind of practitioners related to that lineage. So because I had a connection with them, I think that maybe helped them to trust me. So yeah, that was kind of remarkably effortless somehow to gain Tibetan acceptance and to get into these very intimate stories, really, of somebody's father or teacher or mentor, dying and his last moments and how all of that went. So it was really kind of very touching that they let us into their lives like that. I heard early on, already on that first research trip to Kathmandu in 2014, we made an interview with Matthew Ricard. He's a very famous French monk who's collaborated with scientists, but he became a Tibetan Buddhist monk, a huge celebrity actually in the West, especially in France, about the scientific research into Tukdam, led by Richard Davidson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Matthew has also done some studies with them and stuff. And from that point onwards, I was kind of trying to get access into the scientific side of the research. And that was actually much more challenging than gaining access to the Tibetan communities and the Tibetan stories.
How so?
Well, I think the scientists, they were just kind of a bit wary of me, because I wasn't like BBC or CNN. Like Richard Davidson, he's a very high-profile scientist in America. I mean, he was, I think 2016, he was one of the 100 most important people in the world in Time magazine. So he's very famous, and he has like a huge kind of research institute and big funding and all of that. So I guess he is careful about what kind of image is portrayed of his work. And Tukdam just sounds so crazy to most Westerners, at least, that I imagine that he was just being kind of a bit cautious, like, okay, who do we let in to document this? So that really took a while to get into. I traveled to Madison. I met some of the scientists working on it, and did a lot of legwork. In the process of also just trying to get funding for the film, as I mentioned in the Q&A, Berkeley University in California, they liked some of my previous work that I've done, and they were interested in this research I was doing. So they basically offered support for my research in the role as a graduate student there. So I went to Berkeley, and it was a master's in Asian studies, but really focusing more on the kind of Tibetan theories and understandings of the death process, and like studying Tibetan language and a bit of Tibetan medicine and these kinds of things. And that turned into a PhD at Berkeley in medical anthropology, comparing these different kind of knowledge systems of, modern medicine and Tibetan medicine, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition around death and dying and all of that. So I really went kind of very deeply into it, and I think this subject really requires that to do any kind of fair representation of this phenomenon. So that probably helped that I was doing a PhD at this prestigious university with the scientists, I suspect. I mean, I don't know. And eventually then I got let in to follow the research, and we had a kind of deal where I would document like whatever they wanted me to document, and also film stuff for myself, and I shared the material with them with the scientists group for their own documentation purposes. And of course they have been collaborating here with Delek Hospital, which is a kind of Tibetan modern medicine hospital, as well as Mensa Khan, which is the traditional Tibetan medicine clinic. And those doctors, they've been all carrying out the research in the field together. So yeah, it was 2018, 2019 when I finally could start following that in full. And after that, we've had great collaboration. I'm still in touch with them, and we're actually publishing some articles with some of the people from that group together in academic journals and stuff. So yeah, long process. Probably a longer answer than you wanted.
No, that's completely fine.
Yeah.
It gives me a very clear picture of the amount of work that might have gone into laying the groundwork for the film. But I was wondering if you could also talk about how comfortable or uncomfortable you are with the fact that there may not be a scientific conclusion to this, to the understanding of Tukdam.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the film and also in my kind of academic research at Berkeley, and this is partly drawing on like medical anthropology.
Yes.
Literature, and it's very well established that first of all, you can actually talk about local biologies. So biology isn't universal. Culture affects biology, and vice versa. In different parts of the world, there's actually different biologies to a certain extent. Right. But then, on the other hand, also related to this same issue, the way that we investigate bodies, or say the death process, or Tukdam in this particular case. The kind of theories we have of what the body is, what the mind is, the ways of attending to it will kind of produce different bodies in a certain way. So, there's like really interesting work showing how you can imagine like a Chinese medicine doctor and a Western doctor looking at the same body, but they'll see different things and they'll detect different patterns. But the important point is that they're both empirical. It's not like one is the correct version and the other one is not the correct version. So it's important to understand that modern science is also in part cultural. There's certain ways that it produces its knowledge. These days, it has to be like technologically measured, quantifiable, visible. Whatever data you can produce in that way, that becomes like valid and kind of real knowledge. Whereas in the Tibetan system, they have like incredible attunement to, but just using their senses. I went to see a Tibetan medicine doctor here the other morning, and from feeling my pulse, he could say that I had high cholesterol, which is true. I just took some blood tests a few weeks ago. So they have very different ways of producing knowledge. And in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there's all these contemplative techniques where you really learn to pay attention to very subtle movements of the mind and of the body. So in other words, this is a long-winded way of saying that these different ways of approaching the body and death, they may produce kind of different results, but they're both valid in their own ways. So the fact that science has yet not been able to come up with actually any theory of what's going on here, it doesn't really bother me. I think it's really interesting because they've been trying that for 12 years. I mean, the Tibetans have a very clear theory, a detailed theory of exactly how this is produced and what is happening, but it's just different from, it doesn't have the same kind of background assumptions or ways of necessarily proving it or
Right.
yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And this takes me to my next question, which is that while watching the film and observing the family members, I was wondering how grief works around the practice of Tukdam. Because, like you've very clearly elaborated in the film, in the documentary, that it's a meditative state. It's a certain stage in a meditative state. Right? But for the family members, you also lose somebody very close to you. This is not to say that they don't understand the practice of Tukdam, but how do you negotiate that understanding with the sense of personal loss attendant to that quote-unquote death?
Yeah.
And how did you, as a filmmaker, deal with the concept of death or images of death in the film?
Yeah, I mean, for me it was interesting, as a European, encountering these families where somebody very close to them has died and how they dealt with it. If it was a case of Tukdam, so on the other hand, there was the kind of normal grief and sense of loss that one would expect. But then, because it was this kind of extraordinary sacred death that Tibetans would kind of aspire to, it's like an ideal death, basically. This was kind of mixed then with the kind of sense of pride and a kind of, even a kind of joy. It's like, wow, he really died in such a wonderful way. And I mean, for the daughter in the film, for example, it really inspired her about Buddhism, and she got more interested in meditation and stuff like that. There were some other cases where it was a similar sentiment. Somebody's uncle, actually just above here where now there was a Tukdam case that is in my film, and I interviewed some of the nieces and nephews who we didn't have in the film in the end, but who were very close to this monk, and they were extremely sad. At the same time, they were kind of proud that, wow, my uncle could actually do this. So I think it shows in some ways how actually important and helpful religion can be, or different cultural understandings, say, of death. When you have it in this kind of framework, it becomes something perhaps, I don't know if you can say easier to deal with, but it becomes something profound, and death becomes like a kind of empowering opportunity, especially for the practitioners themselves. It's something to almost look forward to, and if you can die in this way, it's like a final kind of great step in your spiritual practice. But then also the kind of positive afterglow that it leaves in the family or in the community, where it's a kind of inspiration in a sense. So I thought that was really interesting and kind of inspiring. There were other images of death in the film. I don't know if you were referring to the body farm.
That was. How did you work around those images?
Yeah, well, I mean that was tough. So we filmed at this Forensic Anthropology Research Center in Texas State University, known as a body farm. So they just put out fresh human corpses into the grounds of a ranch and just kind of observe and document how decomposition happens, because that process is still not fully understood from a scientific perspective. And some of these scientists...
Yeah, that's
okay.
It's just drawing my attention to the time, but that's fine.
Okay. Yeah.
So you were saying...
Yeah, some of these...
talking about the body farm.
About the body farm, yeah, that's right. So the scientists at the body farms, they were also consulting the Tukdam researchers, just about what would normally happen in a decomposition process and what might be unusual and so forth. So I felt it was important to have this stuff in the film, which is very graphic, and some people really can't take it. In the West, especially, where we really don't see dead bodies ever, except in horror films or something like that. So just to see decomposing bodies has been tough for some. But anyway, because the whole film is about this allegedly unusual process of the body staying fresh and not decomposing.
How about those images?
Huh?
That you collected from the families of the footage that families might have given you of members practicing Tukdam. How did you, was there any particular strategy that went into weaving those images in the larger documentary?
Well, I mean, I was just, in a simple way, I was kind of hoping that they would come across as personal archive in a way. We even letterboxed them, they were actually, most of them were 16:9, which is the aspect ratio of the film, but we just, intentionally made them smaller, 4:3 or something, so that they would stand out as something that was, given to us, that people just filmed on their phones or their little camcorders, and also just the kind of graininess of the quality and everything, and the shakiness, because a lot of the film is filmed in 4K or good HD with good cameras and stuff. So just to have a different visual strand also in the film that hopefully had some kind of authenticity or communicated a kind of directness, or the point of view of the family members or the monks who gave us that footage. But I mean that footage was absolutely the most important footage in the film, because what makes Tukdam so great for a film is it's a totally visual thing. It's you just kind of witness this lifelike body, or maybe even some feeling of presence or something, and those images we got from people who were there. I mean, so yeah, that was essential. But there wasn't any problem getting that stuff. They shared those images very easily and very, very happily. Yeah.
Interesting. And I was wondering if, on an ending note, you could talk a little bit about something that you've touched upon already, but the idea of, this saintly glow around this practice of Tukdam. And somebody at the Q&A had also brought up the idea of, incorruptibles in Christian theology. So I was wondering how you kind of in your process sort of dealt with this mind-body binary, and Was there any like specific motivation towards working on this topic?
Well, I mean, I've been interested for a long time myself, and I guess questions around, well, exactly, mind, body, consciousness. What is consciousness? Yeah, different ideas around that. That perhaps it's not just what the brain does, as Richard Davidson says in the film. I mean, Tukdam is a very kind of I don't know, peculiar kind of case to look at those issues. And here we come again to kind of different cultural systems where for Tibetans, the fact that the body is not decomposing is proof, it's a sign, it's a clear sign that consciousness is there, right? But it's not that for the scientists, actually. For the scientists, the fact that the body is not decomposing, they're actually thinking about, like, maybe it's something to do with the cell metabolism, or maybe something still happening in a very kind of primitive part of the brain, which has nothing to do with consciousness, actually. So kind of just biochemical, kind of biological processes that are somehow slowed down. Just because the body isn't decomposing doesn't necessarily have anything to do with consciousness being present. So it's kind of what this non-decomposing body, it signifies different things depending what lenses you're looking at it. So it was a very kind of peculiar thing to be looking at in that sense. Like the Tibetans I interviewed, they were like, yeah, this is like proof that mind is not just the brain, because the brain has shut down and the body is not decomposing. Whereas from a scientific point of view, that you might not actually draw that conclusion. But certainly the whole question of consciousness, I mean, that is a huge question, and it is one that there is no consensus in science, and there's no kind of solution. I mean, I think a few years back in the Scientific American, there was like 3 big mysteries that science really has not been able to solve, and number 2 was like consciousness. So there's just, it's a very open question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for walking me through the process and delving so deep into the kind of decisions and choices that went into capturing a very complex practice